Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's SCLF webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Alison Mackay and I'm the current chair of SCLF. I'll be your host today, but I'm joined also by Eve Muirhead, who's backstage, who's there to help us out if we have any technical issues, and in case my broadband drops out. Just as usual, before we get started, we have some housekeeping and also one announcement. So our next webinar after this one is going to be on the 5th of December, so put that date in your diary. I'll stick it in the chat as well in a wee minute. And that will be alongside our AGM, and so that will be between 2 and 5 o'clock, and the booking will be open for that in the next week or so once we finalise the programme. There's going to be a number of speakers at that one, and it'll be a good follow on from today's webinar because we're going to be looking at good practice in soil management from various angles. Before then, we'll be making a call for nominations to the Executive Committee. As you know, SCLF is run by a team of volunteers, and we'll be looking for 5 new members to join our team to help us keep delivering for our members. To be eligible for that, you need to be an existing member. And if you're not sure if you're an existing member or not, then if you are currently subscribed to our mailing list, then you are a member. It's as simple as that. If you aren't currently subscribed, then you've got until the 1st of November if you want to subscribe, and therefore after make a nomination to join our executive team. So I will also put a note in the chat of how you can do that as well. The call for nominations will come out in the next day or so, and it will be closing on the 28th of November. And you will need to be proposed and seconded by a member of SCLF. You can propose yourself and seconded by any other member. So that's that, and just some housekeeping. You will have joined today on mute and your camera is off, so you can sit back and relax and enjoy today's session. And if you do need to step away, then don't worry, we'll be able to catch up using a link that you'll be provided after the webinar to our YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions for our presenter today, then just put them in the question box. If we don't manage to answer them live, then we will try to answer them offline as best we can. And last of the housekeeping is just to ask you to please fill in the short feedback form, which will appear when you leave the webinar. And you can use that form to also give any suggestions for future webinars or speakers. So without further ado, we'll just get on to today's session. I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Howlett from Albion Environmental Limited to present today on the important topics of the duty of care and waste characterisation. Andrew is a project director at Albion with over 16 years experience in the environmental and waste management sector. I will put his full bio in the chats, but we'll not keep him any longer, and we'll hand you over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you for everyone for logging on this afternoon and for the invitation from SCLF. So the webinar this afternoon is an introduction to duty of care and waste classification. It's an area I started kind of looking at about 15 or 16 years ago, really probably, I suppose, kind of at the sort of start of my career in this sector. And it kind of started from where we were helping develop a client where they were getting or inheriting SI reports when they were tendering, helping them to kind of sort of translate those SI reports so that they could understand some of the risks, so they could incorporate that within their bid. And one of the things that became clear, one of the areas where they were sort of struggling was the classification and management of soils. Now that obviously can have a huge cost implication on a project, and potentially, if they've not given it due consideration, they could be exposing themselves to, a large financial and potentially also a legal risk. So yeah, that's an area I started looking at and taking an interest in. And like I say, often found that it wasn't given a huge amount of consideration, and obviously in fairness, at that stage in the development, people don't know where the waste is potentially going to be generated on site, what the cut and fill design is, etc. So, it's, while I do sometimes feel it's maybe the kind of poor relation to, contaminated land risk assessments, there are reasons for that at that stage, but it is probably, in my opinion, something that maybe requires that sort of follow-on report of some sort of waste management plan, so that it is given due consideration. I would say from certainly starting back then, things have improved. Certainly, you see a lot more reports where there is a section on waste classification and soil management, but often it's still sort of a relatively small section, and yeah, it's maybe missing that little bit of understanding. And I do still occasionally sort of come across bits of advice where there's recommendations to pass soil data onto like a waste receiving site, like a landfill, for example, saying it would be their responsibility to classify the material, which, as I'll sort of explain today, isn't correct. And I think as well in the industry as a whole, probably there is still a bit of a sort of gap in the understanding around what duty of care is and what the responsibility and obligations are, particularly for waste producers. So the aim of what I'd like to cover this afternoon, and there is a reasonable amount that I'll be looking to cover. Firstly, what is waste? I know it will sound really obvious, and there's probably lots of people that have seen topics or that particular subject covered, so I won't spend long on that particular element, but it puts everything else into context. So it's a good starting point. When are soils and stones no longer considered waste? That is quite a key question we often get asked by some of our clients. Fundamentally, obviously, it's the topic of the presentation or part of it, duty of care, obligations and responsibilities. Then an introduction to waste classification and WM3, touch on WAC as well, waste acceptance criteria, and then to summarize and kind of sort of bring it all to a close, be looking at what should sites be checking when importing and disposing of soils and aggregates onto their sites. So what is waste? Well, if you're looking at the Waste Framework Directive, the definition is any substance or object in the category set out in Annex 1, which the holder discards or intends or is required to discard. But quite simply put, when we're looking at construction sites, if a groundwork contractor or the developer needs to excavate material for cut and fill reasons, for drainage, for the foundation design, to get to formation level, and they can't incorporate it within the site, and it needs to go off site, and that material is going to be waste material. So why might waste producers or those working in industry think it's perhaps not waste? Well, one of the reasons that we sometimes come across, or people will try and make an argument and say, well, look, the material's valuable. I've got some screened topsoil, for example, that's come off from the site. I know someone on another site who's crying out for this, and would pay money for it. There's value to it. Equally, you see waste contractors who are maybe taking in mixed, either mixed construction waste or even just taking in, soils and stones, and then they're screening it and producing a screened topsoil. Again, they're looking at stockpiles of material and going, well, look, it's got value to it. People are, crying out for topsoil. There's, why do I have to still consider it waste? So we're going to touch on that, but I suppose, while that's a market demand, if you like, might be one of the reasons why things aren't considered waste, it certainly wouldn't be the overall factor. And whether it is non-polluting or looks non-polluting. Now, say looks non-polluting sort of intentionally, because I've been involved on sites, for example, where someone's got a pile of, like the demolition contractor, for example, has left a stockpile of a demo material. It looks, to all intents and purposes, just like a pile of aggregate, and the contractor either on that site or another site can say, well, I can use that for my piling mat. Look, it looks pretty clean. But again, that's not the overriding factor on whether something can be classed as waste or not. And just because it looks like there's no contamination in it, as I'm sure we all appreciate, that isn't necessarily the case. I've obviously seen stockpiles where, it's looked fairly clean, and then when you go to test it, suddenly you find that there's asbestos fibres that are getting picked up by analysis, maybe because there was asbestos in the building and, it might have been stripped out, but through the demolition process, there's some residual fibres left. Or it could be that, maybe there was some bitumen type products or something within the building. As that's been crushed and demolished, that's ended up in the fines. Before you know it, you've suddenly got a stockpile with elevated hydrocarbons in the fines. So, just because something looks non-polluting, there's value to it, doesn't mean that it's no longer considered waste. And even if that material, even if you're giving it on to someone else, or your client's giving it on to someone else, and they're going to reuse or recycle it, it's still legally considered to be waste. So if the person that produced it had to dispose of it, then that's still a waste material that you've passed on, they are then handling. So when would you, that's obviously, there are got to be examples when it's no longer considered waste. There's those, good aggregate and soil out there that we want to be reusing on developments. And the main sort of definition really is once the final recovery operation has been completed. And an example of that would be the aggregate protocol, so which is the quality protocol for the production of aggregates from inert waste. So if there's that aggregate protocol in place, if that's been developed for the site and it's been produced to a particular standard, and I've got a slide in a second that just kind of go through that process in a bit more detail, then it would no longer be considered waste. And there are some other quality protocols out there, for example, for compost as well. So there may be a quality protocol in place. There's also some other specific guidance, for example, SEPA guidance on promoting the sustainable reuse of greenfield soils in construction. And again, if we're working on a greenfield site that's got a surplus of material that's been moved somewhere else, then potentially that will not be regulated under waste legislation, as long as it is handled in line with that regulatory guidance. And again, I've got a slide which will just go through that in a little bit more detail. So to summarize that sort of waste journey to an end of waste status is just a brief example. So we've got someone come along, a contractor that needs to dig up some soils and aggregates. They've got to be excavated as part of the earthworks. They can't be reused on site. There's an intent to discard, therefore it's waste. It gets loaded up into the wagon and taken off to, well, hopefully a recycling facility. And again, it's still sort of waste during that process. It gets to recycling facilities, so for example, soil wash plant or some other type of waste transfer station where that material is going to be processed and hopefully turned into a product. But while it's undergoing that processing, it would still be considered waste. And then finally, you get to a point where you've got an aggregate which can be dispatched from site. It meets the requirements of the quality protocol. So it's achieved a particular standard. So for example, 6F5 or a bedding stand, for example, and then it would no longer be considered waste. So you've got this whole section here, the first two kind of sort of boxes where we are looking at waste, and then the end, which is obviously the goal we're trying to get to, is where it's no longer considered a waste anymore. We've also, as I mentioned, touched on briefly before, the reuse of greenfield soils. So by greenfield sites, in accordance with the guidance document, we're looking at undeveloped land, forestry land, agricultural land. And then there's a series of uses within that guidance document. So some of these examples are, like another construction site where it's redeveloped for housing or a commercial development. You've got embankments for roadways, like road verges, maybe for screening or some sort of noise attenuation, and then within SUDS design as well. Now, obviously, there's a few things that you need to comply with to achieve compliance with this guidance. it's got to be greenfield and soil uncontaminated. So, you're looking for some evidence that the material is actually greenfield. Now, if it's a site that's been redeveloped, I mean, there will have been an SI produced at some point, so there should be some evidence there that's backing that up. And there's also limits to the depths that this material can be placed at. So this is thinking about the receiving site. So if you're excavating topsoil, for example, from a greenfield site, then the top, then that can be placed at a depth of 100 to 150 mil at the receiving site. If it's the subsoils that you're excavating, then it's 300 to 450 mil depth, again, at the receiving site. And I suppose what they're looking at there is, that's a kind of sort of fairly standard capping depth for landscaped areas on a lot of redevelopments. You also need to, when you're placing the material, it needs to be within the agreed, planning volumes and sort of final finish levels of the development. So not just using it as an excuse to create unnecessary bunds and unnecessary amounts of material. And obviously, again, it needs to be within that planning boundary. So again, it's not being used as an excuse just to dispose of material when it's creeping out with that red line boundary. And then lastly, is that there's a declaration of compliance form. So at the back of that guidance document is a one-page form which should be submitted to SEPA, and that could be either the producer or the receiver of the waste. Normally, you would see it's the it's the supplier of it, and it's a one-page form which should be submitted to SEPA. You don't get any sort of notification back from SEPA, so it's different to exemptions, for example. But obviously, SEPA could, in theory, audit these declaration of compliance forms to check that material has been moved in accordance with that guidance. And it's quite a straightforward form. Like I say, it's only one page. From memory, I think basically you're looking at the volume, the site, the source site, the location, the date that it's going to be happening. It's not difficult information that's going in there. So it should be a simple thing to provide. It also excludes some uses as well. So, for example, backfilling disused quarries. There you'd potentially be looking at either an exemption or a waste management license for recovery. Also doesn't permit storage on third-party sites. So if you see, if you've got maybe like a waste operator that, or someone that's supplying soil, and actually what they're doing is they're taking soil from one site, they're then taking it to their waste transfer station or somewhere that's operating under an exemption, and they're screening that material, and then they're selling that on as a greenfield compliant topsoil. That's not actually following the guidance. And then lastly, peat arising from construction activities on peatland. SEPA's got a separate set of guidance for that activity. So again, it wouldn't fall under this particular guidance. Ideally, we're trying to keep this material on site. So, there's also on-site reuse of excavated waste soils, which again, hopefully, then you're not necessarily having to worry about the waste legislation as such. So yeah, SEPA won't regulate under waste management controls as long as you've got the sort of following criteria in place. So the use has to be a necessary part of planned work. So there has to be, basically what it's allowing you to do, move soils from one part of the site into another part of the site, but that has to be part of the planned works. You can't suddenly create a bund, for example, for no apparent reason. There has to have been some sort of reason that there's upfill in a certain area of the site required. It needs to be suitable for that use. So, obviously it has to be geotechnically and environmentally suitable. It shouldn't need any processing or treatment before it's used. If there was treatment required or some processing, then you'd have, that's still possible, but someone would have had to come in with maybe a mobile plant license, for example. You want to be making sure that there's no more than the quantity necessary is used. And again, it's making sure that it's not an excuse just to hide material and avoid disposal costs, because disposal costs are expensive. So it is, making sure that it's only going up to the agreed final finish levels at the site. That you've got a certainty of use and it's not just a mere possibility. The situations you're trying to avoid there is where you've got, maybe multiple phases of a development. The first phase creates a stockpile of surplus material and thinks, oh, it's okay because we use that possibly across the latter phases, and then it works its way around the phases until you end up with a big stockpile at the end that the final phase has to deal with. That was just a possibility of use. It wasn't a certainty of use. And obviously, importantly, we want to be making sure that any reuse of the material is not going to result in pollution of the environment or harm to human health, which would need to be considered and assessed. So I've hopefully covered a bit of what is waste and when we need to think of it as waste, when maybe we can think of it as no longer being considered waste, or deal with the movement outside of waste legislation. The other important thing is duty of care. Like I say, I do sort of a bit of training on duty of care for ground workers, waste operators, waste producers, a whole kind of sort of plethora of different people in that waste chain. And I think it's sometimes a concept that's still not fully appreciated. And the main thing that you're looking at here, and the key principle of duty of care, is that it's everyone's responsibility and duty to ensure that waste is managed correctly and safely. So it's not just the waste carrier, it's not the groundwork contractor, it's not the waste manager, the waste receiving site, the landfills, the recycling facility, for example. Everyone's got in that whole chain has got a responsibility to ensure that it's managed correctly. So that includes obviously your waste producers, waste managers, waste carriers, brokers, etc. And that's enshrined in law. So what are the obligations and responsibilities? So I'll start with the waste producer. I think arguably they're the most important person in the chain. They're the ones that are responsible for producing the waste in the first place during the course of their activities. And I think sometimes that is in danger of being forgotten. Often, I see site investigation reports or soil data being passed on to maybe like a landfill or a recycling facility like a soil wash plant or some sort of screening operation. But it's just handed over as like, here's the investigation, here's the data. What they don't know with that information is they don't know where the waste, or potentially, unless it's provided as well, but often they won't know where that waste is being generated. And sometimes I see it where actually it's just soil data on its own without any context of what the history is or material description is, etc. So, the waste receiver, the waste manager can't be expected to understand, what was the final cut and fill of the site. Okay, we've got a site investigation here that's maybe there's, an issue in trial pit 1 at 2 meters depth, but actually is anything coming from that location? Or maybe there's, some horizons of made ground or an area of the site that's not been tested, but actually waste is coming from that. That's information that would really come from, those generating the waste and the design team involved in that. So their responsibilities, firstly is the waste hierarchy. I'm sure everyone's kind of familiar with the waste hierarchy and what that involves. There's loads of diagrams that show what the waste hierarchy is, but here's sort of fairly simple one. And firstly, you're looking to, producers should be looking to prevent waste in the first place. Is there any way that the site can be designed so that you're minimizing any cut actually coming off the site? Is there anything that can be done to remove waste in the first place? Even with the best will in the world, normally there's going to be a requirement for something as you put in caps and foundations and drainage, etc. But maybe there's something that can be done to reduce that volume, maybe some sort of geotechnical solution that limits the amount or reduces the amount of waste being generated, which helps with that. Also looking, are there any options to reuse? Maybe the site's got some topsoil on the site that could be reused if it's segregated appropriately and tested to confirm it's suitable. Maybe there's some deep excavations on the site that's generating some surplus subsoil that again, if clean and segregated and tested, maybe that could be reused on the site. If we've explored those avenues, I appreciate often, sites, they may not have room to stockpile that material to reuse. So, then next we need to look at recycling. Could it be taken to a soil washing facility, for example, or some other waste transfer station that's screening the material and reusing, the aggregate that they can get out of it. And that's potentially something that could be done on site as well, with screening, getting a trommel and a screener on site, maybe a crusher as well. Recovery, I couldn't really think of any examples of really sort of recovery where, obviously this is the waste hierarchy, this applies to all waste types, and recovery, normally you're thinking about things like energy from waste plants. So probably not really too many examples that soils would fit under that. And then lastly, disposal. So, if it's ultimately going to end up in landfill, and also even exemptions, people they would really sort of consider that a disposal route as well. You need to make sure that you're only transferring waste to authorised persons. So, that's if whoever's going to be the waste carrier, making sure that they've got a waste carrier's license, and that's something that can be checked online. And, that anyone that it's going to's got an appropriate waste management license, exemption, or a PPC permit. And again, these are all easy bits of information just to check, have you got this documentation in place, and they should be able to provide all that. As a producer, you need to complete a waste transfer note, which would be for non-hazardous soils, or a consignment note, which would be for hazardous material. And it's making sure that that's been filled out correctly, and that it's been described appropriately. So the examples that maybe we would have seen in the past where someone's described the material as muck, for example, that's not an appropriate description. It doesn't tell people, what's actually within the waste, how they would manage it, if there's any risks that they need to be aware of. And as part of the description, which leads into the waste classification section, is has there been, you need to apply a European waste catalogue code to it as well. And this is where WM3 guidance comes in, which helps you be able to make that decision, which I will touch on it in a bit. And then lastly, you want to prevent the escape of waste and prevent the waste causing any harm or pollution. So if it's asbestos contaminated soils, for example, is that going into sealed skips? Is it being sealed in some other way to prevent release? Avoiding stockpiling soils next to surface water courses, for example, where they could potentially get runoff and cause a pollution incident. Those are the sorts of things that we're looking for. As I say, there's other people in the waste chain as well. We've got collectors of the waste and waste managers as well. They've got much the same responsibilities in terms of applying the waste hierarchy and avoiding contamination, etc. But a couple of extra ones that they need to be aware of. As the waste collector, the waste collector's turning up on site and being handed a waste transfer note, they should be checking that note to make sure that it's been completed correctly before they accept it. And they obviously also need to be registered to carry waste with SEPA. Then the waste manager, again, they've got a few extra, and something to be aware of when we talk about waste managers is that if you, as a site, like a construction site, for example, if you're accepting waste onto the site and you've got an exemption in place, then technically you're accepting waste, so you would be a waste manager. You need to make sure that you've got appropriate exemption in place. So yeah, it's just to make sure that, we always think of the waste manager, oh, that must be the landfill site. But if you're accepting waste under an exemption, then technically you could fall under that description as well, or whoever's operating the site. And then lastly, the other thing that I need to be aware of is ensuring that the waste that they receive is accurate and contains all the information necessary for safe handling, treatment, and disposal. And I appreciate, a lot of this is ideal world scenarios. Sometimes there's commercial decisions that go on, and this isn't always followed as closely as it should. But this is you know, what duty of care stipulates. So that's a kind of sort of run through duty of care, and I'll kind of bring that up in the sort of summary at the end. Then wanted to move on to giving a brief introduction into waste classification and what waste classification is. Now, waste classification it's different to risk assessment. It's a completely different way of looking at the soil data that we look at through site investigation reports. During a waste classification, an assessment, we're identifying whether a waste displays hazardous properties or not, and whether they're above their relevant threshold, which then determines how waste should be handled, treated, and disposed of. So the types of hazardous properties that we're looking at there is whether a waste is maybe, and bear in mind that this is relevant to all waste types produced, from like your household waste that's collected to various types of industries and commercial collections. So it's not just obviously soil and stone, so it's covering a whole plethora of waste types. But the hazards that it's looking at is whether the waste is explosive, whether it's flammable, toxic, carcinogenic, ecotoxic, and whether it contains any persistent organic pollutants. So obviously the ones that I suppose with waste soils you most commonly come across are things that are maybe carcinogenic or ecotoxic, and depending on the site, persistent organic pollutants as well. And this is different to risk assessment. With risk assessment, we determine the probability of harm occurring as a result of exposure to contaminants, and we're using that source pathway receptor model. It's just I suppose it's just highlighting that they are, I think waste classification sometimes added on as a bit of a kind of sort of tag on, but it is a completely different type of assessment that needs to be looked at slightly differently. So why is it important? Why should we spend time looking at this and giving it consideration? Well, firstly, it's a legal requirement to do it, and the producer could face potential liability if the waste isn't handled or it's deposited somewhere incorrectly. So it's something that we need to do and take due consideration of. It's helping to ensure waste is safely handled and disposed of. Okay, we're looking at a site, but then that material is being passed on to carriers, operators of landfill, operators of waste transfer stations and wash plants. We've got their own set of operatives that are handling and dealing with the material. So if we've got contaminants or hazards within the waste that we're passing on to people, we've got a duty to make sure that they're fully aware of what any potential hazards may be, so that they can safely handle it and dispose of it correctly. It's also something that's required by the waste operators. A waste operator who has a waste management license facility or a PPC permitted facility or an exemption will have a set of waste codes that they can accept onto their site. And they need to be able to demonstrate to SEPA as the regulator that they've only accepted those waste types. They need to fill out waste returns. They need to go back to SEPA. They need to be able to demonstrate that they're only, that they're following the conditions of their license or their permit. And that information then goes on to SEPA, and that information is being used to develop government policy and national reporting to inform decisions on new waste infrastructure. So it's important that we get that information correct. And if we get incorrect classification, it can have significant cost implications. Disposal rates, for very clean, non-hazardous material could be less than £10 per tonne, but obviously, the other end of the spectrum, dealing, up to, £200 per tonne. And it doesn't take a huge volume of material to turn those into, significant 3-digit figures, which can have a huge cost implication. So as I mentioned, part of the getting that description right is getting the correct EWC codes, the European Waste Catalogue Code. So what is that? Well, it's a non-exhaustive list. It's a series of waste types that was established by the European Commission. and it differentiates hazardous and non-hazardous waste. And that's quite an important point. I think, you know, you may see often on bills of quantities, for example, or discussions with developers and contractors, you know, they maybe talk about inert, non-hazardous and hazardous. When it comes to waste classification, there are effectively two types of waste, often lots of waste types, but in two types of waste in as much as they're either hazardous or they're non-hazardous. And the European Waste Catalogue is broken down into 20 chapters, and these are, most of them are industry-based, so all the green ones that you can see on the screen at the moment, they're all industry-based. So, you know, things like waste from the agricultural industry, from wood processing, etc. And the one that, you know, those of us working in the construction industry most often dealing with is 17, which is construction and demolition waste, which includes excavated soil from contaminated sites. So that's the kind of most common one, but you may also come across maybe 19 codes, which will come from waste management facilities. So if you're receiving soil maybe from a waste management facility or some other material type, aggregates, for example, then, you know, you may encounter 19 codes as well. And then that is broken down. So from those 20 chapters, they then have sub chapters, and then to get the 6-digit code, then there'll be the final 2 digits are specific to the waste type. And just to kind of sort of help visualize that, so here we've got pile of soil. It's been classified as 170504. So where does that come from? Well, the 17, the waste has arisen from a demolition site. So it's covered from chapter 17. That general description, so the subchapter will be waste, soil and stones. So that's where 05 comes from as subchapter. And then finally, it's identified by the digits 04, which means that the soil doesn't contain any hazardous substances. So this is non-haz, soil and stones. But I suppose the question really, and this is the whole point of what you look at with waste classification is, well, how do you know that? How do you know it doesn't contain any hazardous substances? Which is where WM3 comes in. So WM3, it's a joint industry guidance document, and it outlines the 15 different hazardous properties, and it's the guidance used to classify waste. And there are 4 kind of entry types within that. There's absolute hazards, absolute non-hazards, and then mirror hazardous and mirror non-hazardous. So the absolute hazards are things like 170303, coal tar and tar products. It's always hazardous. If you're dealing with it, it's a hazardous product, so, or hazardous waste. So that's kind of the end of the assessment. Then you've got absolute non-hazardous, so maybe separately collected paper and card. You know, it's not hazardous material, so it would be an absolute non-hazardous, and that's, you know, you don't need to go and do further assessments on it. And then the mirror entries, which would be maybe familiar with soil and stones. We've got the hazardous mirror entry for soils, which is 170503, and then the non-hazardous entry 170504. And the procedure, that whole procedure and WM3 assessment is well, several topics all on its own, but a brief outline of that procedure is, well, first you need to check if the waste needs to be classified. Most of the waste that we deal with will be. There are certain special types of waste which won't be, you know, radioactive waste have got their own guidance, etc. We need to identify the waste code or codes that may apply. So, for example, with soil and stones, we're looking at the 170504 or 170503. So there's 2 waste codes that could apply. Needs to look at what assessment is needed to select which code is correct. Determine the chemical composition of the waste, where your sampling comes in. Identify from that sample results whether if the waste is hazardous or contains hazardous substances or any persistent organic pollutants. Look at and assess those hazardous properties, see if they're above a threshold, and then finally assign the code and describe the classification code with any duty of care, transfer notes or consignment notes. So how do you find out the waste composition and assess these mirror entries? Well, in a nice scenario, you'd have a manufacturer safety data sheet, which would outline the hazards within it. Obviously, we don't generally get that with soil and stones, unfortunately, unless maybe you had a spill of something, known product or waste. So it means that we need to fall into looking at the sample and analysis data to try and work out its composition. And once you've determined its composition, then you need to identify if any of these chemicals are hazardous substances or they're persistent organic pollutants. So there's a few challenges when you're looking at soil and stones. Like I say, it's not as easy as just getting a material safety data sheet. So that chemical composition of the soil is generally unknown. We've got to rely on soil sampling data. How representative of that type of soil is to the wagon load of material that's been excavated from the site. You know, if that sampling data has come from the initial SI, which was being done for primarily a contaminated land reason or for planning purposes, you know, does that reflect the material that's being excavated? Because, you know, the foundation design, the cut and fill may have changed since those samples were taken. Does it represent that? And also an important point is that WM3 assessment and the soil analysis suite will depend on the site history. So much the same as risk assessment, obviously that's something we're looking at as well. But, you know, seen it from, you know, some people that are looking to dispose of maybe a stockpile of something, and they go to a lab and say, well, look, can I get a WM3 test? And that's, you know, again, it's not like an off-the-shelf test as opposed to WAC, for example. You know, it's not an off-the-shelf one with a set list of parameters. You should be looking at, you know, what is the history of the material and what contaminants could be potentially there. So again, some of these challenges, and this is again one of the reasons, or one of the areas where it differs from risk assessment, is that not all hazardous properties are based on single contaminant thresholds. Some of the contaminants act cumulatively. So, you know, what I mean by how that's different is where you've got generic assessment criteria, you know, for arsenic and lead, nickel, etc. And those are the sort of values you're generally looking at, and you're looking at them in isolation. Within waste classification, some of those parameters and contaminants can actually act cumulatively. So it's not as straightforward as having just, you know, a single value as such. And the other thing is that the soil analytical data will just give us a concentration of the metals, but it doesn't tell us what form that metal is present as. You know, obviously we're not sitting with a stockpile of soil with a lump of arsenic and nickel and lead inside it. You know, it's going to form some sort of species within the waste, depending how it's oxidized, etc. So that's, you know, that's what we're looking at, and that information doesn't come from you know, a standard environmental lab. Again, I'm not going to go through this bit in too much detail, but just to give a little example of that kind of sort of classification process. So, for example, you've got zinc. It's been identified at a concentration of 400 milligrams per kilogram. But what we don't know is what it's there present as. So that means we need to make some decisions. We need to think, well, what's the worst case scenario? Or based on the history of the site, what is it most likely to be there as? And in the absence of that, maybe it's a residential site where we know there's been material imported, but we don't actually, there's no records to say where from. We maybe need to make some worst case scenarios decisions. And so a worst case scenario would maybe be zinc chromate. And this is where the sort of chemistry comes into play. We're looking at, well, okay, what's the atomic weight of zinc? What's then the molecular weight of chromate? What's the molecular weight of zinc chromate? And once we've calculated that, we can then look at right, okay, well, if we've got 400 milligrams of zinc, how much zinc chromate could that create, for example? And once we've figured that much out, we would then need to go, right, okay, well, what hazardous properties does zinc chromate actually have? Have any of those individual hazardous thresholds been exceeded? Are there then any cumulative hazardous thresholds with any other contaminants we've got within the waste? If there is any sort of issues there, maybe we could discount some of the worst case scenarios. Maybe we've done some hexavalent chromium testing, for example, and so we know that that can't form. Or, you know, maybe there is something in the history that we can rule out certain things. And then we go from doing that to then having to repeat it and look at all the chemical results that we've got. And you can see why tools such as Has Waste Online are generally used, because obviously it takes a lot of that away and does those calculations for us. So what about WAC? Well, WAC's generally simpler. It is a set test. You just ask for a WAC test and you get a WAC test generally. I mean, sometimes they will ask you if you just want the inert version or hazardous, but generally if you ask for a WAC, that's what you get. So it's reasonably straightforward. And it is set criteria within it. But it's the key point, and I know this is often pointed out, but it shouldn't be used for waste classification purposes. It doesn't include a full suite of tests. It doesn't include asbestos, for example. There's no solid metals in it. You know, depending which lab you've used, the TPH may not cover the full range that's needed for waste classification. So it doesn't include everything that's needed to make that assessment just because it's that fixed criteria. And it's not what WAC was ultimately designed for. WAC is a waste acceptance test for certain classes of landfill. And that sentence there, certain classes of the landfill, is important because it's not all classes of landfill. It's designed for inert landfills and hazardous landfills, but also you may have some hazardous waste, but it's a stable, non-reactive hazardous waste, maybe something like asbestos. You know, it's will be hazardous if it's above 0.1%, but you know, it's quite stable, it's not going to leach. And you can have non-hazardous landfills that have got like a designated cell to take some stable, non-reactive hazardous waste into that cell. But there is no WAC criteria for a non-hazardous landfill. So if you know, for example, you could look at some of the criteria here. If you know, for example, like PAHs, the inert criteria there is 100. So if you've got some non-hazardous waste, but actually you've got PAHs above 100, and there's no point doing WAC because you already know it's going to fail WAC anyway because you don't meet it for that. So it's potentially not needed, or for that, some of the material anyway. One of the key things, I suppose, really about WAC, one of the differences are that they're limits that can be accepted by the landfill. They're not limits that are exceeded that it makes it a particular waste. Like, for example, I've seen people look at the hazardous waste criteria before, that final column, and they've seen elevated total organic carbon, for example, and they go, all right, okay, well, that's failed hazardous waste. That means we're dealing with hazardous waste. That's not how this works. That assessment of whether it's non-hazardous or hazardous comes from the WM3 assessment. This is just criteria. You need to be below those limits to get into certain classes of landfill. So it's an important distinction. It's designed to analyze the leaching ability of contaminants in the soil and how they will act in the landfill environment. And as I said, firstly, it needs to undergo a WM3 assessment. And then, depending on the disposal route, it might need to undergo WAC testing. But landfill is only one option. Like I say, it could go to a soil washing facility potentially, another type of waste transfer station it could go to, or some other recycling operation. And maybe they don't need WAC as part of their acceptance criteria. So, you know, it shouldn't be the default to go to, because depending on the disposal route, it may not be required. So what are some of the issues then? So we're getting site investigation data through, you know, what are some of the contractors being faced with, what they're having to look at. We're looking at an SI that's been designed for contaminated land purposes and for planning, etc. You know, what are some of the kind of pitfalls that we need to look for? We'll need to look at the logs. Is there evidence of hydrocarbons, asbestos containing materials, etc.? And have they been sampled? And yeah, have they? And do they include the material that's actually going to be excavated? You know, for example, here maybe these layers of made ground have been analysed and they've been found to be hazardous. But what about the material? We've got a layer of concrete that could potentially be segregated and disposed of at a cheaper rate. If there's deep excavations going on, there's another layer of made ground underneath. Has that been tested? Is that also hazardous? Now, within this particular one, it does say hydrocarbon odours noted, so it could well be. But obviously, unless you test that, you don't know for sure. So, you know, making sure that the material that you're excavating has been analysed. Forgive the crudeness of the plan, but you know, looking at the TP locations, are there any gaps? You know, is there an area of the site that's been that hasn't been analysed? Well, there may be good reason. Maybe there's a building, services, etc. But if material is going to be excavated from there, then some follow-up work's needed. And yeah, like I say, does it represent the waste that's going to be generated? we'll want to be looking at has a WM3 assessment been undertaken? You know, this is a Has Waste Online output. Is there something like this contained within the report? Has it been considered? And if it has been included, have they assessed and looked at all the samples within the report? You know, here's one. It was just, you know, a trial pit 3, 10, 11, and 18. You would assume there's lots of numbers in between that. You know, what's happened to those samples? Why haven't they been assessed or considered? So it's kind of looking at those things, making sure that everything has been looked at, certainly relative to what's going off the site. So to kind of wrap up and bring it to a close, I just briefly want to go over some of the summary of some of the sort of key messages and things that should be looked at when disposing of soils. Has the WM3 assessment been undertaken for the material going off site? Does the waste carrier have a waste carrier's license? And does the receiving site have a waste management license, PPC permit, or exemption to accept those waste soils? And again, these are all really easy things. Check, and if you ask these questions, they should be able to provide it. Now, if we're importing material, equally, you know, what should be checked when we're importing soils and aggregates? Has aggregate been produced in accordance with an aggregate protocol? You know, if you're importing aggregates from a supplier, again, you know, is this recycled aggregate? If it is, okay, right, is there an aggregate protocol for that in place? And again, they should be able to have a statement to confirm that, and also the testing certificates to back that up. If it's coming from a greenfield site, can they evidence that? A number of times I've been told it's a greenfield site, asked for some evidence. I've just got an email back saying, yes, it's from a greenfield site. You know, that's unlikely to be sufficient evidence for if it's asked for by SEPA or by the local authority as part of a validation report. So, you know, but it's information that the supplier should have. If it's a greenfield site, someone must have done a site. A lot of chances are someone's done a site investigation for it. And, you know, someone should be able to provide a declaration of compliance. Like I say, it's not a difficult form. You know, it should be easy to supply. And if the above don't apply, and you are receiving what would be classed as waste soils or aggregates, if it's non-compliant with an aggregate protocol, has the site that's receiving it got a waste management license exemption in place? Has that been applied for by SEPA? And then lastly, obviously, is that material suitable for use? And you know, making sure that it's geotechnically and environmentally suitable. So that's brings us to an end of everything I wanted to cover this afternoon. I hope you found that of interest and some bits in there that might have been useful. If you have any questions or comments, happy to take a few questions now, or obviously happy for my contact details to be shared and follow up on the back of this. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very quick whistle-stop tour of all things waste. I know, I appreciate it was an awful lot to try and get through in an hour. I think there's plenty of things that people can go and read up on afterwards, and we have loads of questions. So we'll try and take as many as we can, and we'll probably have to take some of them offline, I think.
Yeah, no problem.
So I don't know, can you see the questions there, Andrew, at all? I have tried to assign them to you, so I'm going to read them out, but just so that if you want to be able to read them, then you can see
okay.
So you mentioned, sorry, I'm just trying to get this so I can read this properly. So you mentioned soil washing operations leading to recycled aggregate, but aggregates quality protocol doesn't permit inputs including soils, as this person understands it. This is from Jonathan. So how do soils get managed as non-waste in Scotland post segregation activity at the recycling facility?
So a soil washing plant, the aggregate quality protocol does allow 170504 material. So a soil washing plant will be able to, obviously there's only certain soils, really clay soils, they won't be able to process obviously, but certainly coarse soils, they will be able to take that through a soil wash plant. They will be able to pull out the aggregate from that material and the stone, and what they'll then be left with is a compressed filter cake. But 170504 is on the aggregate protocol, so it should be something that they're allowed to accept. And there's a number of operators that are in Scotland. Loads have opened up relatively recently that are popping up here and there. So yeah, there's quite a few options for that.
Thanks for that. I guess just sort of linked to that, like obviously there is this quality protocol for aggregates. What's your thoughts on why we don't have one for soil?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a, I feel it's definitely a bit of a gap. There's loads of probably good quality soil that could be reused on site. So it's a shame that there isn't a quality protocol or standard out there that allows that. From discussions we've had with SEPA, I know part of their concern is the variability of the incoming material. Obviously, it can come from a whole different range of sites. So there is challenges around that, and I think some of them are, in terms of testing, I think you can get around sort of reasonably easily. You know, you can potentially produce it to British standard, for example. You can test it for human health criteria. The real challenge comes in where if you're looking to demonstrate that the soil doesn't pose a risk to the water environment, because where you don't know where, if you're in a situation where you don't know where that material will be used, you can potentially have to take a really conservative assessment because it could be used anywhere. And then in that scenario, sometimes the criteria can become so conservative that it becomes basically unworkable. So yeah, that is a big challenge, but I also think it's a bit of a gap, and it is a pity that there isn't that protocol available like there is for aggregates that prevents soils being reused.
Jonathan had also brought to our attention the fact that the Clear Dow code of practice, the definition of waste code of practice, excuse me, that they've launched a sort of international version of that, sort of a soil passport declaration. So I think that's maybe something that could maybe be looked at in terms of adopting as a voluntary way to try and reduce the amount of waste that's going to landfills, basically, that doesn't have to be.
No, absolutely. The kind of DALCOP, obviously, it's not something we use up here. Yeah, no, on paper, a lot of it looks really good, but then I know from a lot of people that I've spoken to, customers and things like that, south of the border, that, you know, like anything, it's not without its flaws as well, and there's a lot of frustration down there about how it's operated. But yeah, no, absolutely, there's, with new kind of guidance coming out in international standards, that's definitely something that could be that should be looked at to a degree.
Going to a question from Naomi. Naomi says that SEPA's land remediation and waste management guidelines state that they don't apply to permitted development. So basically development not needing a planning permission. So if the work is being carried out on a site which is permitted development, is there a situation in which soils excavated on the site and kept on the site become a waste?
Good question. I am totally honest, I would have to have a think about that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I probably would need to have a think about that. I don't know, maybe someone else has got some thoughts on that. I would need to have a wee think of that one.
I mean, I think probably the reason that it doesn't apply is because it's site specific.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So because there's no other regulator looking after it, then the sort of like the guidance I think says come and speak to SEPA about it, because it'll depend, I guess, on why the soil's been excavated. You know, if it's been excavated because it's not suitable for use where it is, then it might not be suitable for use where you're putting it. So therefore,
no, absolutely, that makes sense.
Yeah. Next question. Matthew's asked, in your understanding, is the waste producer the contractor who excavates the soil, the person who's basically instructed the excavation, or the landowner?
Yeah, another good question. I'm trying to think, one being kind of sort of posed before. I suppose it's technically it should be the owner, of the land, but then obviously they do delegate that down through, or should be delegating that down through a contract that whoever's kind of developing it then will manage that material on their behalf, and then they would then obviously have a duty to make sure, you know, you couldn't have a ground worker, for example, who says, oh, well, I'm not the landowner, therefore it's not my responsibility. You know, that has been passed down to a certain extent. So yeah, they are still within that waste chain. So I think ultimately it probably apply it to all, but certainly any cases that I've seen that have then ended up hitting the courts, it's been the ground worker, it's been those that have actually excavated and disposed of the material that have been hit for it, rather it sort of filtering its way back up the chain.
Matthew did say at the end of his question, or should it be identified as part of the construction contract? And I think, yeah, it would be something that would be it would be a contractual liability then, I think, is how that would be dealt. And case law, I guess. Matthew had another question about bricks and concrete. Because there are mirror entries within WM3, should testing be undertaken on these materials to determine whether they're hazardous or non-hazardous? And if testing is required, what should you be testing for?
I suppose, I'm sure I saw this somewhere recently, actually. I'm trying to think where it was. This was a discussion point somewhere. But yeah, I guess like anything, you'd need to probably have a look at the history at the material and what potential contaminants might be associated with it. So I don't think you would necessarily have to default to testing if you knew a bit of the history. You know, it's not come from it potentially could have been entrained, like maybe it's in a building that had asbestos, for example, and some of that material could still be within the bricks and concrete, then obviously that would need to be tested. You know, could there have been any risk of bitumen, or like, so could there be any hydrocarbons in it? So yeah, it would take a little bit of a kind of, you know, but you know, if it's just a brick wall and you can quite clearly see that it's all brick, then yeah, a bit of common sense probably you wouldn't expect people to test that. So yeah, you'd need to have a look at it. Sorry, it's not a black and white answer really, but yeah, no, it's like anything in waste. It's kind of knowing the history, visually looking at it, and then making a decision from there.
Thanks for that. Another question from Naomi. Is it always necessary to carry out lab testing for POPs in any soils that might become waste? Is it possible to discount the possibility of these being present, for example, looking at the site history? Yeah,
I think if you can, if you've got enough evidence that you can justify based on the history that they shouldn't have been, they shouldn't be present, you know, same way as that might be done during a site investigation for contaminated land purposes. If you can justify that, you know, that they're definitely not there, or they definitely shouldn't be there, then yes, I think you could exclude them from the analysis suite.
Well, and I think just one final question. If WM3 classification testing and WAC testing are carried out at the same time to avoid a second GI, is it possible that a soil could be classified as needing to go to a hazardous landfill by WAC, but is non-hazardous according to WM3?
Yeah, well, I certainly have seen that, and I appreciate that sometimes for timing reasons and to avoid a second mobilisation. Often the WAC test and the soil testing are done at the same time. The challenge always is you're kind of almost second guessing what might happen from the SI. So, like for example, you're not, unless you see something really obvious when you're doing the GI, you might not know where you're going to suddenly find elevated metals and encounter hazardous material, and in which case you may not have taken the WAC from the right place. That's more for just, I suppose, just something to be aware of when scheduling them both at the same time, but it's sometimes almost better if you can phase it. So if you can take maybe the extra samples, have them on hold, have a quick look at when the results come in, and then maybe from there you can decide which ones maybe you should be taking. So that's sometimes possible. But in terms of whether you can get a different classification, yes, I have also seen that, where you could perhaps, you do your WM3 assessment through, maybe you've done TPH-CWG, for example, and then obviously you've got a different TPH test within the WAC result, and you can have a low TPH-CW or total TPH result, but a high TPH result in your WAC test, and they can conflict. And I know I think Ian Bishop gave kind of sort of a talk about that sort of fairly recently in terms of the differences in TPH testing. So yes, you can end up with that situation, and I think if you do end up in that situation, then it's speaking to the lab to find out, what's happened with the, what types of TPH analysis were undertaken, and potentially you do then need to do some confirmatory analysis just to confirm that classification.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to catch up on that webinar, that's on our YouTube channel. The link is in the chat. You can go and have a look at that.
Nice
there's a whole hour on that topic. Exactly. So I think that's all the questions that we've got just now. I think we've managed to get through them all. So without further ado, just say thank you very much again, Andrew, for your time today, and thanks to everybody else who's joined us. Just a reminder that we will be calling for nominations to the exec committee in the next day or two. So please do try and get involved. The more people that we have involved, then the less the burden on everybody. But yeah, it's a great thing to be involved in, and there's still plenty of work to be done in terms of trying to keep the good practice up in this sector. So thank you very much again, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.